Boronia Station is your standard outer suburban, underserved Melburnian station. Off-peak trains are not frequent and peak trains are crowded. Nothing unusual there. But with its reopening from a quick refurbishment, I think it's worth a look, as the history of the station, and its level crossing, is dark and political. The Ringwood to Fentry Gully Railway first opened in 1889, with stations at Bayswater, Lower Fentry Gully and Upper Fentry Gully. At the time the line opened, there was no real white settlement around the area where Boronia is now situated, with Bayswater being the main centre of the district. Even the basin was more settled, with enough people being around for a tramway from Bayswater to Sassafras via the basin to be proposed. This lack of population didn't discourage Fentry Gully Shire President J. Miller from advocating heavily for a station at what was becoming known as the LL Road crossing. Work might have even started, but then the Victorian Railways realised something. They were wanting to do things as cheaply as possible, and there was no one, really, apart from Miller and a few others, living in the area. So there was to be no station. This didn't stop certain real estate agents from lying about the existence of the station. Would it surprise you that this estate, advertised in 1888, based off the location of the non-existent station, was never built? Other estate agents weren't much better, advertising a fictional Scoresby station around the same site. Over the next 20 or so years, more people did start moving into the area, as the first selectors who had moved in began subdividing their land. The first new agitation for a station was around 1901, although that was easily dismissed due to lack of population. A report from 1906 stated that building a station on the proposed site would cost £300, that's around $58,000 today. This was too much for the government to consider. 6 years later, in September 1911, there was enough political momentum to have a deputation sent to the Railways Commissioner, asking for a station. This was, once again, easily dismissed. But things were changing. Between 1912 and 1914, 700 acres of land within a mile and a half of the proposed station had been subdivided. This added up to 200 blocks of land in total, mostly small orchards, but also a handful of holiday and weekend homes, and importantly, a few permanent family homes. The thing is, this settlement still wasn't important enough to actually have a name. It was still regarded as part of Bayswater, or Fentry Gully, it changed over time, and so the residents were told again and again that they already had a station. In turn, the residents told the government that having to trudge 2 miles to get to their local station really wasn't good enough. In 1915, the settlement finally received its own name. Prominent horticulturalist, councillor, and soon-to-be Shire President, Alfred Chandler, who was also the largest landholder in the region, was asked to come up with a name for the area around the LL Road crossing. He discounted Chandrella and Chandler and settled on Boronia, the name of the main plant that he grew in his nursery. It still took a while for that name to stick, however. In February of that year, 1915, a meeting had been held at the LL Road level crossing, demanding that a station be provided. It was agreed that another deputation was to be sent to the railway commissioners, but in May they were once again told there was no money available. They were told the same thing 4 years later, in June 1919. But then things changed quickly. That same month, June 1919, saw an election for the upper house of the Victorian Parliament take place. Alfred Chandler was elected, and in July another deputation, reportedly the biggest ever made to the railway commissioners, was made. This time, with the backing of him as a parliamentarian instead of simply a Shire president, they received an entirely different answer from the one that they had received the previous month, that an immediate investigation into the cost of the station would be made. In August it was confirmed that the station would be built. However, there was a condition attached that had not been made for any other station in the state. The station would be opened basically on probation. It must prove that it did in fact have enough support to warrant its opening. As such, the locals had to pay for a station master for the first year of operation, and also keep a tally of how many people used the station and the revenue it produced. After that, the railways would decide if the station was viable. The first step for the locals was to find a station master, and to find the funds to pay him. In November, Percy Turner, a local artist, was appointed, and the Boronia Progress Committee made arrangements to pay him 5 shillings a week. This being acceptable to the Railways Department, construction of the station began. Construction only took 7 months. On the 7th of June 1920, the station opened. 200 people gathered, speeches were made, and a brass band played. It was noted that the station had the best platform in the entire metropolitan area, being the first to be constructed entirely of concrete. That is, however, basically all it had. There was no siding, meaning there was no capacity for any goods traffic, which was one of the main arguments for building the station in the first place. And there were no facilities other than a small waiting shed. There was also confusion about how much revenue the railways would consider as necessary to staff the station themselves and to keep it open. In January 1921, the railways agreed to install a ladies' waiting room and gentlemen's toilets. In June 1921, the figures for the first year of operations were released. There had been 10,193 outgoing trips from the station, and a revenue of £953. This was enough for the railway commissioners, and they agreed to staff the station themselves, and to build a goods siding. The railways did staff the station, but the goods siding does not seem to have ever been built. The station was now fully and officially open. In December 1920, a meeting was held to discuss the road situation in Boronia. It was raised that the current level crossing at LL Road was too narrow for the expected traffic in the area now that the station was open, and that the crossing at the present time is considered dangerous. In 1924, residents of Boronia requested that a passenger crossing be established at the station to make it easier for residents to access the platform. Harold Clapp, the Railways Commissioner, was not thrilled with this proposal, alluding to the dangers of level crossing at the site. He promised to investigate the possibility of a footbridge. A footbridge was never built. At around 6:30 p.m. on the 26th of April 1926, a motor carriage carrying 25 people was heading north, along today's Dorset Road, toward the level crossing. At the same time, a train was racing along in the same direction, from Fentry Gully towards Boronia. The train driver, seeing the vehicle approaching the crossing, sounded his horn 2 times, and the carriage appeared to be stopping. But then, according to the driver, it sped up again and ended up in the middle of the tracks. The driver immediately applied his emergency brake, but it was too late, and he crashed into the van at near full speed. 9 people died instantly and 15 were injured. A 10th person, a child, died a couple of days later. It was the worst level crossing crash in Victoria at the time. A group of scouts was on the train and immediately sprang into action, helping the injured and making the site safe. A monument now stands to them. A coronial report concluded that it was a case of accidental death, and that the level crossing itself was dangerous. People began to demand protected level crossings across the state. The government responded by restarting a campaign from a couple of years earlier, telling drivers to cross crossings cautiously. This was not well received. At 4:30 in the afternoon, on October 29, 1944, a car carrying 5 people was driving west along Boronia Road towards the crossing. A train was once again travelling towards Boronia Station from Fentry Gully. A coronial inquest later decided that the driver of the car was probably blinded by the afternoon sun and didn't see the train that he drove straight in front of. A horn was heard by locals seconds before the crash. 4 occupants of the car died instantly. The 5th died the next day, having never regained consciousness. There were still no lights or bells at the crossing, and the government still declared that the crossing was safe. This is despite the deaths and the countless other near misses, many of which were not reported, and at least one of which resulted in the death of a cow. On September 6, 1950, once again at around 4:30 p.m, a couple driving west along Boronia Road drove directly in front of a train coming from Fentry Gully at about 40 miles per hour. They were both killed instantly. The coroner declared that the crossing wasn't particularly dangerous if drivers were paying attention. The railways echoed this declaration, saying that the Boronia level crossing was one of the safest in Melbourne. It was, in fact, the deadliest in Melbourne. Newspapers and residents were beginning to get angry. The railways, however, refused to even put up flashing lights, arguing that they would cost £2,000 and that crossings with lights were more dangerous, as motorists tended to race across crossings when the lights activated. They also said that since no accidents had occurred between 1926 and 1944, that the crossing was safe. The locals countered that this figure did not include near misses. The Mountain District Free Press declared that the only way to make the crossing safe was to remove it. They also acknowledged that this was not likely to happen anytime soon, but that it was a public scandal that the railways would not even acknowledge that there was an issue. The crossing was about to show just how much of a scandal this was. In August 1951, a bus carrying a football team was hit by a train at the crossing, resulting in 9 injuries but no deaths. Still, the railways declared that the crossing was safe. No flashing lights were to be provided. In October, 2 women escaped injury after their car was hit by a train on the crossing. These were simply the precursors. On June 1st, 1952, a bus carrying a group of Bible study students from the Church of Christ approached the crossing. The bus driver stopped, looked both ways, saw nothing, and then proceeded into the crossing. The bus was obliterated by a train coming from Ferntree Gully. 7 occupants, mostly teenagers, were killed instantly. 2 more died in hospital. At least 20 others were badly injured. The death toll of the crossing now stood at 26, with more than 50 injuries. There were also countless near misses which were not reported in any newspaper, but which locals constantly saw. Just months after the June fatalities, the railways, finally, promised to install flashing lights. But still, there would be no boom gates. The day the lights were installed was a day of great celebration in Boronia, almost on par with the celebrations 30 years earlier when the station was opened. But it was also bittersweet. The lights were good, but the crossing was still dangerous. With no boom gates, the crossing would remain dangerous. The local Liberal Member of Parliament, ex-General Sir George Knox, declared that Boronia would not be safe until the crossing was entirely removed. The lights were simply a stepping stone. It would take another 50 years for this dream to be realised. But boom gates were at least, finally, installed in 1972. As stated earlier, when the station opened, it consisted of a simple waiting shed with a single platform. Soon, a ladies' waiting room and gentlemen's conveniences were provided, much to the appreciation, surely, of a certain commuter, a Mr. Fed Up, who wrote into at least 2 newspapers to complain about the facilities at Boronia. It would be a long wait until any further improvements were made. In 1930, the footpath to the station was improved. This was such an important improvement that it made the newspapers. In 1937, a reader of the Melbourne Herald wrote in, requesting improvements to the station. The railways responded by saying that the facilities, a veranda, a shed, and the ladies' waiting room, were sufficient for a station the size of Boronia. It would take another 17 years for anything major to happen. This is despite the constant calls for improvements by the Boronia Progress Association and others. In 1954, the railways finally realised that it should probably build a proper station on the site, considering that the shed that was built in the 1920s, and that they said was sufficient in 1937, was only ever meant to be a temporary structure. So they promised to build a new, bigger building, a proper goods shed and a bike shed with space for 40 bikes. It was also to be a wooden building, like the original. This was around the same time that locals were beginning to realise that the only way to make the Boronia Road crossing safe was to remove it. The government probably realised this too, but economics trumped safety, and the intersection was already so complex that removing it in an economic way would prove to be very difficult. Instead, in 1957, the railways decided to make things even more complicated at the Boronia Road level crossing by duplicating the line from Bayswater to Ferntree Gully. This meant Boronia now had 2 platforms. The main station building was on platform 1, serving trains towards the city. This building lasted until May 1972, when it burnt down. As it had been falling into disrepair over the previous 15 or so years, this was not really that surprising. And naturally, this being Boronia, where things take a lot of time, the replacement building took 13 years to be completed. It opened in 1985. At least one website says that this building burnt down in 1988, but I can't find any evidence of this online. There might have been a fire, but I don't think that it's destroyed the new station building. If you know anything, tell me in the comments. But in any case, the station building was not long for the world anyway. One of the few positive decisions in terms of railways made by the Kennett government related to Boronia. From the 1980s, it was becoming obvious that the railway crossing was going to have to be removed. If not because of safety concerns, the RACV declared that the intersection was still one of the most dangerous in Melbourne, but because traffic was being so heavily affected by the crossing. By the early to mid 1990s, it could, at some times, take cars 15 to 20 minutes to get through the intersection. This is because 5 roads were still converging, along with the railway crossing itself. This led to the crossing being described as the Berlin Wall. Ambulances and fire trucks were constantly caught in this snarl, and it was beginning to affect other crossings in Bayswater and Ferntree Gully, as locals tried to avoid the intersection by any means necessary. Various proposals were raised by the Knox City Council, from a form of what would be now called Skyrail to a complete bypass and ring road around Boronia, to putting at least one of the 5 roads, most commonly Dorset Road, into a tunnel. It was obvious that the council did not have the funds for any of these proposals, and no government was really interested. That was until the lead up to the 1996 election. In 1992, the Liberal Party won the seat of Knox from Labour, and they were determined to keep it in 96. They were also determined to keep the seats of Monbulk and Bayswater, which very closely bordered Knox. As such, in the lead up to the election, the Liberal Party promised to remove the crossing. This helped the local member, Hurtle Lupton, secure a swing towards himself, and meant that the crossing was to be removed. The removal of the crossing was no doubt a very good thing, and in the lead up to the 1999 election, the Liberal Party would point out the economic benefits of the removal. But it was also clearly political. No other dangerous level crossing would be removed by the Kennett government, and there were many around, and no funding provided for any other station rebuilds. But still, it was a good outcome. By 1997, a contract worth somewhere between $25 and $28 million, depending on who was talking about it, had been signed with John Holland, and tunnelling commenced. The government promised it would be opened in 1999. It was a remarkably efficient build, especially considering how unique it was for Melbourne at the time. The original railway and crossing remained open throughout the building process, as the tunnel and new station were built on a slightly different alignment. By late 1988, the station was complete, and the new station was officially opened on the 5th of November of that year. Various other ceremonies were held throughout 1999 as other sections of the station, including the bus terminal and the Boronia Junction shopping centre, were completed. And there the station remained, slowly ageing and weathering, and somehow ending up on many lists of the worst station in Melbourne. An undeserved but unsurprising epitaph, based on reputation more than actual reality. But then, Labour decided to pull the same trick that the Liberals did in '96. Jeff Kennett lost the '99 election, and the Liberal Party has only ruled for 4 years since then. In 2018, Labour, somewhat unexpectedly, won the seat of Bayswater, the electorate that now covered Boronia. Like the Liberals in '96, Labour decided that they would very much like to hold the seat. So in the lead up to the '22 election, Jackson Taylor, the member for Bayswater, announced that a re-elected Labour government would completely transform the station precinct by building over the station at its southern end to provide new public space, and through the reconstruction/refurbishment of the station concourse. Like Lupton in '96, this helped Taylor win the seat again, with an increased majority, despite media claims that the seat would be easily lost. And then reality set in, and the original plans were scaled down. The void at the south of the station was to remain and not be built over, which was a massive change from what was promised. However, the other changes, a rebuilt concourse, a refurbished and upgraded entrance road and drop-off area, on the aptly named Lupton Way, and the creation of a new park between the station and Dorset Road, were all very much welcome and needed. And that brings us up to today, with a 21st century upgrade to a 20th century building on a site that was prepared for a station in the late 19th century. Boronia has changed beyond comprehension in that time, and the station and its upgrades have spurred on much of this change. This new refurbishment can only lead to another range of changes.